So as we turn to Paul's personal comments at the end of Romans 15 and 16, we have to keep in mind the historical setting, because we take it for granted that there are established Christian churches in virtually every major city of the world. But when Paul was writing to the Romans, it was only about 25 years after the ascension, and it was absolutely crucial that the churches become stable and that there be stable churches in all these major cities across the empire. They would be a platform for not just the geographical spread of the gospel at the time, but the historical, chronological spread of the gospel throughout the future. And the biggest challenge by far to the early Christians was the relations between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. It would have been absolutely disastrous if a schism occurred early in church history where there were Jewish churches and then there were the Jewish Christian churches and then the Gentile Christian churches. It would have severely damaged both the credibility and the appeal of the gospel, which claimed to transcend race. And so it's one thing that 1,500 years later in the Protestant Reformation that there was an explosion of denominations, but that's after 1,500 years of mostly a very stable one church type idea, or at least until the Great Schism in 1000 A.D. And it really makes a difference historically that there's 1,000 years of stability before we really reach a true giant schism. And Paul and the apostles fought very vigorously and selflessly in order to establish this idea of there being one body, and it was remarkably successful over many, as I said, many centuries. And Christians today, we would do well to turn back to these scriptures and look at how Paul and the apostles sought to establish this one body and the strategies they used, the tactfulness with which they tried to establish the one body. So let's look at this in chapter 15. I raised the question last time, how exactly does Paul's itinerary, all this discussion of his itinerary, and then this gift he's going to make to Jerusalem Christians, how does that in some way relate to this idea of the one body? So the immediate context is that some Roman Christians, because they're in Rome, which is like living in New York City, would fancy themselves pretty important people. And they're in the most important city in the world, because Rome towered over every other major city in the world. And they might have thought that Paul should have already visited them. And of course now they find in this letter that he's addressing them very soberingly, very seriously. He's exhorting them strongly about their attitudes toward Gentiles in chapter 11 and chapter 14, the chapter we just went through, the section we just went through. So it was crucial that the Apostle Paul, especially being Jewish, that he sort of established what his motives were. So if we look at this in chapter 14, he says, first of all, verse 14, of chapter 15, he says, I myself am satisfied about you, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able to instruct one another. Translation, I've written very strongly to you, but I the whole time I've been writing, I've been very confident from what I know of you that you would, on your own terms, be able to exhort one another to these very same things. These are things, in other words, I know you're going to agree with. So he's not terribly worried about whether this is their own attitude. And of course, Paul isn't just saying this for the way, he's being sincere, he's authentic, he really means it. But at the same time, for tactfulness purposes, it's crucial that he actually say it. Then he goes on to say that why he hasn't visited them yet. And the bottom line is that he has been traveling all over the place, all over the Gentile lands, because by the grace of God, that's his ministry. He said, thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. In other words, the main reason he hasn't been to Rome is because he's been focused on all the other major cities of the empire where there wasn't yet a Christian witness. So God had, by his grace, God had given to Paul this apostleship because of the grace given to me to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles. And so he was trying to preach the gospel. And there was already a thriving work in Rome, so it wasn't really necessary that he get over to Rome yet. But now, since he was looking to establish the gospel in places where there had not yet been a witness, and he wanted to go to Spain, he says, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. In other words, he wants to go visit Rome, but he's not really coming there to sort of reestablish what's already established, which might even make the Roman Christians feel a little better or more at ease about his visit when he comes. He's planning to use it as a platform to go on out to the west, to Spain, where there weren't many churches, or hardly any churches apparently at this time. So again, you can sort of see him tactfully dealing with the fact that he hasn't visited Rome yet and what it will be like when he visits them. And of course, Rome being a city of such immense wealth and resources, the Christians were crucial to fueling the witness for Christ in the world throughout their empire. And of course, if you're a Roman Christian, it's not really a good thing, is it? If you're living in Rome, you're at the epicenter, and you're really not doing much for the gospel. Meanwhile, you have Paul traveling all around your empire, witnessing for Jesus Christ. So it might just feel a little bit like, hey, if we haven't been doing much yet, certainly we need to get on board and help fuel this witness to keep going. Not suggesting they weren't doing that, but certainly that's the way I would have felt when I received the letter. And it would help when he showed up that they had the letter, and then they would be reminded of the commitment that he was expecting from them, which of course he knew they would be fully behind. Now, as for the gift, why is he mentioning this thing about the gift? Well, probably because he thinks, let's go back just a little bit. He says, look, there's Gentiles up in Macedonia and Achaia, that's Greek Christians, who've been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Now, why is he telling him about this? Because he's been working tirelessly to collect a love offering for the Jewish Christians who are particularly oppressed and persecuted in the city of Jerusalem. And if that gift comes from the Gentile churches, that will be a practical, strategic way to unite Christian and Jewish Gentiles, Jewish and Gentile Christians, and to reaffirm the one body. And the key was, as Paul said, is that you pray with me to God that two things happen. One, that I may be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea so I can make the gift offering. And two, that my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints. It'd be a disaster if he showed up in Jerusalem and the Jewish Christians were too stubborn or pig-headed to take the love offering from the Gentile churches. So again, notice his strategy. It's reinforcing the one body. All right, so that's chapter 15. It's kind of a sketch, anyway, of the big picture. The last chapter, of course, the famous long list of names that Paul personally addresses people. It's not all that's in that chapter. There's some other little nuggets in there to pay attention to. But so one thing to look at are the things that aren't the list of names, and why might those things be important? And then secondly, why this long list of names? So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.